Well, hey, welcome back. We are so thankful that you've joined us this week for the Love First podcast. And of course, as you can tell, we've got investigative journalist Jerry Mitchell back with us. And Jerry, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Last week, you left us on the edge, and so we're going to pick up there. And we're excited about that. If you are returning, thank you so much for supporting this important work. Thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing. And also, if this is your first time, we want you to know that the purpose of this podcast is to catalyze courageous conversations to revolutionize the way that we love each other. And so I just want to thank you for joining us for the Love First podcast. And let's get right to it.
Love first, I know. Love first, I know. Lord, take control. Lord, take control. Love first in my soul. Love first in my soul. Lord, take control. Lord, take control.
All right. So, Jerry, for those that weren't with us last week, take a moment, reintroduce yourself, and then we'll pick up with the story.
Well, I'm an investigative reporter. I now run a nonprofit known as the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting. And so if you know any big donors out there that want to give us money, let me know. But we're trying to basically, because, and it's not just Mississippi, but it's felt more acutely in Mississippi, you know, these newsrooms have been shutting down. We want to continue to provide this important, look, it's hard-hitting investigative reporting, I think, that makes democracy work like it should. And people have information to make those decisions that they should be able to. Yeah. I think that's part of the problem right now. We've got a lot of noise out there.
Yep.
And we need trusted news sources that we can go to. And so, I got started in this journey back in 1989. Saw the movie Mississippi Burning. It kind of sent me down this trail of looking at these unpunished killings, I guess you could say, from the civil rights era. And there are more than 120 of those. But the book deals with four of them. Four of the unpunished, in terms of cases, 4 cases.
Yes. And before we move off of this, the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting, people can look that up, and MCIR.
MississippiCIR.org. If you want to come look at our website, we'd love to have you. We've written a lot about everything you can imagine. So we certainly investigate reporting is what we do. We're doing a series right now. It's getting ready to come out called Poverty in the Pandemic. So we're looking at places that have been, it's just shocking. I mean, there are places where it's exposing these kind of holes in our healthcare system and things like that, that a lot of these rural hospitals in Mississippi have shut down. And so you got people that are having to go, an hour or more for care, different things like that. So it's not a good situation.
This is important work, and something that I've learned through you more acutely, as well as some people in our own church who do this kind of investigative reporting, is that you become a voice for the voiceless. You tell stories so that other people can, their voices can be elevated so that they can be heard. And something that is so striking to me is that in the case of these unprosecuted civil rights era murders, that literally it was investigating reporting that led to the reopening of these cases. And so you had a direct impact on justice being brought to these cases.
And I'm not alone in that. I mean, I'm not the only reporter who's actually done this work. And so there have been, I think, 24 convictions in these various cases across the U.S., which is an amazing number. And I'm quoting someone else that's saying that basically a reporter's work led to the reopenings, I think, of almost either the reopenings or in terms of evidence, contributing toward the evidence of the case. So,
well, let's dive into these next.
All right, let's go.
So last week, we started with the Mississippi burning case. Freedom Summer, 1964. There was a very light conviction of the Klansman that ordered the murder, Sam Bowers.
Nobody got prosecuted for murder.
No one got prosecuted for murder. And that kind of hit a dead end. But in the middle of all of that, you came across the opportunity to reopen the Medgar Evers case, which did lead to the conviction of his killer, Byron Dilla Beckwith. But overlapping in all of this is also, especially overlapping with Sam Bowers, is the Vernon De Mer case, January 10th, 1966. So take us to that case, open it up for us, and tell us what happened.
Yeah. Well, Vernon De Mer was a farmer, businessman, entrepreneur, but totally dedicated to voting rights. He believed that America would begin to change, voting rights begin to change, which African Americans didn't have, like basically Mississippi and much of the South, and to be honest, across the country, even, on back in time. So basically, that's what he was dedicated to. And the Klan didn't like that, attacked him and his family in the middle of the night, as you mentioned, January 10th, 1966, about 2 o'clock in the morning, firebombed, the De Mer home. Began firing their guns into the home, and Vernon De Mer woke up, grabbed his shotgun, ran to the front of the house, began firing back at the Klansmen so his family could escape safely out a back window. But unfortunately, the flames of the fire seared his lungs, and he died later that day. A few weeks later, in the mail came his voter registration card. He fought his whole life for the right of all Americans to be able to vote, but never been able to cast a ballot himself.
Yeah.
And so Sam Bowers ordered that. He was the head of the Klan. He ordered that attack, and but was never convicted. And so the De Mer family approached me after Byron Dilla Beckwith was indicted, which was in late '90. And so I met with them, and they kind of began to tell me the story, which I knew nothing about. In fact, Vernon De Mer is kind of one of those untold stories of courage and in the civil rights movement. And interesting addendum, because I'll forget it if I don't think, because I thought of it right now, is there is now a statue of Vernon De Mer outside the courthouse.
Wow. So here we have a man who, because of his lighter skin, could have passed for
white. He was that light. His dad was white, actually. He had a white father.
Yes. Chose to embrace his full self, and that was an extremely difficult path, but he was a successful business person. He provided employment for people. He was known to be willing to offer the financing for anyone who could not pay the poll tax.
He would pay poll taxes for people, and he collected the poll taxes at his grocery store. And that's one of the reasons the Klan attacked was he had basically was doing that,
and doing everything he could to give people the opportunity.
Absolutely, registering African Americans, all those kind of things.
Yes. And
by the way, by this point, the Voting Rights Act had actually passed. So it wasn't like, you had federal registrars coming in and the guy was the circuit clerk there, was a notorious Theron Lynn. He was found in contempt of court for not letting, Black Mississippians register to vote, et cetera.
Wow. So how did you find a break in the Vernon De Mer?
In that case?
Where did the break come from?
Well, it came later. Initially, it looked like they were going to, the DA acted like it was going to do something, and then he got cold feet over time. And so then another DA came in that seemed to have been less interested. And then I'm literally at grad school at Ohio State. I went mid-career to Ohio State. I got a fellowship. So I'm literally working my master's. And I get a call that spring from this guy that said he has information on the Vernon De Mer case and wants to meet with me. So I flew back to Mississippi. It was me and a few sons of Vernon De Mer, a few other folks. we met, and he told his story about how when he was a kid, he worked for Sam Bowers, and he had basically overheard Sam Bowers give the orders to kill Vernon De Mer. And so we, the case got reopened essentially, and he went undercover for a while, basically talking to Sam Bowers, which I think is one of the more interesting parts of the book, of him kind of going undercover and talking to Bowers, and then eventually, and then the other key thing was a guy named Billy Roy Pitts, who was involved in the killing, dropped his gun, got caught, pleaded guilty to murder, got a life sentence for that, and then pleaded guilty to federal charges and got time for that. And bottom line, I found the guy, and he was living in Louisiana, and there's a relatively young thing at that point called the internet, and that's how I found it. and I turned out he had not served a single day of his life sentence, and I reported that, and so he got arrested. And yeah, it's a long story short, but essentially Bowers got arrested in spring of 1998.
So let's put this together. The murder is in 1966.
Correct. Now we're talking about 1998, which was 32 years.
32 years have passed, and a key breakthrough comes from a guy who got a life sentence and never served a day of it.
Never served a single day.
So one of the things I want us to kind of surface in this second part of our conversation is that it's hard sometimes for, in our current, like 2020 conversation, I think it's hard sometimes for people to know that there is a load of context.
Yes.
To this difficulty of trusting the entire system, from the DAs to the prosecutors, all the way down the line.
It was, like you look in the previous case, you're talking about Byron Dillbeck, where you had 3 police officers testifying for the defense. So, basically lying, claiming they saw Byron Dillbeck. But one of them, by the way, was spotted as in FBI records as being at Klan meeting. So, and then, of course, later on, we already mentioned the Mississippi burning case, you had law enforcement actually involved in the killings.
Yeah.
So, so those are the kind of things, if you understand that context, why African Americans, for those of us who happen to be white, and we, maybe there's some that wonder, well, what are these African Americans upset about? Why are they upset? And if you understand the context and the history, of course, there's immense distrust, in the African American community because of this history and other things.
This is part of why I wanted to surface this conversation, because at times a conversation can seem out of place to some people,
right? But
it feels like a never-ending story to other people, and so.
Well, I talked to all these families after what happened to George Floyd. I actually went and interviewed these exact same families. And for them, this is like a renewal of it's like nightmares again.
Wow.
Of what Murley Evers told me. It's just
yes.
Having to relive all this. It's just, it brings up all of that anger and hate and things like that you thought where you were past, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It just kind of resurrects seeing George Floyd and, of course, young man Ahmaud Arbery,
Breonna Taylor, and
it's just awful. And so it's just, the reason history is important is we can try to learn from it. And if we don't learn our history, which we're not very good at doing, unfortunately, in this country, then we tend to relive it, and we tend to go in cycles and do the same thing over, same stupid things over and over again.
Yes. And when you mentioned that number, 120 of these cases, right?
Yeah, more than that. I don't even know the total number.
we know some of the more famous ones, but
most you don't. Most people don't. They're the vast majority of that number you don't know.
Yep. So Sam Bowers gets convicted, and for context for this podcast, Sam Bowers did not die until 2006.
That's right, in prison. Yeah.
So again, in kind of a little bit of our mindset that this is distant history, that myth keeps getting confronted by something as simple as dates. I also want to bring something up. You said last week, you said, hey man, I've lived here long enough now, I'm a Mississippian, right? And so my wife and I were talking about this the other day. We've lived in Atlanta for 24 years. For both of us, that's longer than we've ever lived anywhere, right? Including where we grew up.
Congratulations, you're in Atlanta now.
So we do deeply love our city. We love Atlanta. We don't just live here. We love it. We're invested in the city. And so like you and Jackson, I know I'm going to embarrass you with a moment unsuspected. So for everyone that's listening, sorry to my host, Jerry here, but a famous author from Jackson, Eudora Welty, who made an indelible impact on the literary world, one of her biographers lives in Jackson. And so Jerry set it up for us, my wife and I, to go meet her, get a tour, a signed copy of her most recent book. But in that time, when we just mentioned to her how much we appreciated it, she said to my wife and I, she said, Jerry Mitchell is a national treasure. We love him in Jackson. And I wanted you to know.
It's very kind. You know,
So, but why am I saying?
I give glory to God.
Amen. But the reason I'm saying that is because sometimes we don't realize that committing and investing ourselves in the places where we live, we don't understand that seemingly small things can, together with all the other people that are working hard, can help to yield good outcomes for the benefit of our community. And I just wanted to highlight that. I don't mean
that's kind of,
but I wanted to highlight that. So as we take another step, then another very, very important case that you touch on in the book is the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, September 15th, 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. Tell us about how you got involved in that case.
Pretty simple. We decided, my editors and I decided after Bowers was convicted, it was kind of like, and I even had people say to, who's next, Jerry? You know what I mean? Because you after a couple of cases, there's this reputation, and suddenly you're expected, you know. But we decided, well, let's write about these cases that are already being looked at. Like what cases are out there and are being looked at. And so that's what we tried to do. And one of them was the FBI had already reopened it, or the Justice Department had, but the Birmingham church bombing, as you mentioned, which was carried out by the Klan in 63. And it was in response to basically school integration there. And so that was what happened. And so I actually went over and interviewed Doug Jones. I kind of hit it off. And still to this day, we've got along really very well.
Yes.
And I did a little profile of Doug. I found out that the grand jury was looking at this and actually broke that story in October of 98. And the interesting little tidbit on that story is that story, AP picked it up and it ran nationally. And Bobby Cherry is one of the last living suspects in that case.
Yes.
And I interviewed him as well for that story. Well, turned out his ex-wife, whose name was Willadine Brogdon, had read that story that I wrote about that the grand jury was looking at this again. She had no idea. She literally got in her car and drove more than 200 miles to the nearest FBI office in Montana. And then told her story about how, first that Bobby Cherry had basically admitted that, he was involved in bombing.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned earlier, these various reporters that had worked along the way.
Oh, yeah.
So Bill Baxley had done some work previous, right?
Yeah, he prosecuted Bob Shambles, who was convicted in 1997.
Right.
1977, pardon.
So we've got Bob Chambliss, right? We've got
Thomas Blanton.
Right, Thomas Blanton, Jr.
And Bobby Cherry.
And Bobby Cherry. Now, again, as a timestamp for our listeners, how current is this? Thomas Blanton Jr., who was is convicted in the killings,
Right.
died last month.
Yeah, he did. He just died last month.
June 26, 2020. So again, I just want
I actually texted Lisa McNair, who's the sister of Denise McNair, one of the 4 little girls who was killed in the bombing. And I said, because they had to go through a parole hearing for him. And it was very painful for the family.
Yes.
And so I just texted her and said, no more parole hearings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen. Think about that. Jerry, I shared with you a story. I was invited to speak in Detroit at a wonderful event of black and white Christians there, and
Great.
wonderful churches that had sponsored that event. And after I was done speaking, a woman and her husband approached me, and she gathered herself. She would be in her 70s. She gathered herself and she said, I played with Denise McNair
Wow.
on Saturday.
Wow.
And
Wow.
then she just stopped.
Yeah. Wow.
I played with her on Saturday, and that speaking encounter was last year. And so I think it's very important for us to recognize that
Right.
it seems as history to some,
Right.
it's lived experience to others.
Right.
But you got involved in this case. You recognize that there's
I went and interviewed Bobby Cherry.
Okay, so let's go for Bobby Cherry. Tell us about that experience and what unfolded.
And that was my strategy with all these cases, was go talk to these Klansmen as early as possible, because I knew they would shut up at some point. And I knew they would, that it worked in the Medgar Evers case to some extent, and I wanted to kind of continue that pattern.
Yep.
And so when interviewed Bobby Cherry, he lived near Tyler, Texas, which is not far from where I grew up, which is a schizophrenic town of Texarkana. So anyway, I went over there and talked to him, took him and his wife out for barbecue, because I guess that's what you take Klansmen out for. I'm not really sure, but we talked for probably 6 hours. And he's just like, I didn't have anything to do with that church bombing. I left that sign shop. The sign shop he's talking about is about 2 blocks from the church.
Yeah.
And he's like, I left that. So they were making Confederate flags and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I left that sign shop at 9:45 because I had to get home and watch wrestling. And he pulled out this sworn affidavit from this woman. I remember that night where we're all sitting around watching wrestling. So I got back to the newsroom the next day and talked to our librarian, Susan Garcia. And you, like me, remember when the newspapers used to run the entire TV schedules in a very small box in the newspaper. It wasn't even that big, right?
That's right.
The entire TV schedule, because it was only on 12 or 14 hours a day, and you only had 2 or 3 channels, right?
That's right. And you didn't want to miss wrestling.
You didn't want to miss wrestling. And so Susan the next day came back to me and said there was no wrestling. So it turned out there hadn't been wrestling on for years. And so obviously I reported that. And when I called him, interestingly, he doubled down on it. He insisted he was still correct.
No alibi.
Yeah, so basically his alibi, got blown away. And then he was also involved in the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth, which I found the footage for, who was a very brave civil rights leader in Birmingham.
Yes.
He was the one behind the campaign that Dr. King came in for, the
Got it.
Birmingham campaign with the dogs and the fire hoses that we've all seen, and the letter from Birmingham jail.
Yeah.
That was all Fred Shuttlesworth. I mean, he had been beaten and church blown up, house blown up. I mean, incredibly brave guy. And so
Bobby Cherry was behind that as well.
was involved with that one as well. There's even footage of it, which I didn't know, but I found the footage.
Wow. When you go, if those of our listeners who might be interested in doing this, I'd like to suggest something to you.
Sure.
I'd like to suggest, first of all, to our listeners that you take a trip to Birmingham. And when you go to the 16th Street Baptist Church, then right across is the Shuttlesworth Museum, right across the street. Across the street from that is a park.
Killingham Park.
Where you can see a memorial of the four girls. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, right? Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair.
Denise McNair, yeah.
When you go from there, then you might then make a stop in Montgomery. You can go to EGI. You can go to the museum there. You can go to the lynching memorial. But
there's also one for the 40 martyrs.
Yes,
the rights movement, as well as the others. Like I was talking about the 120. That's kind of the others.
No, is the one is the one for the 40 martyrs? Is it in Jackson?
No, I'm talking about in Montgomery. You're talking about in Montgomery. And now they've also got the Rosa Parks Museum. That's
yes. And then if they make their way to Jackson, what I want to encourage people is this. There is a vital and rich history in Jackson and the Mississippi Delta. And there are places you can go. There are museums you can visit. And these things are...
The Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, I got to put in a plug for it. It's in Jackson. Is, in my opinion, one of the best regional civil rights museums in the country. Yes. It's incredible. And the people who are in the movement actually agree with me on that. At least most of the people I've heard who are connected to the movement in some way.
Yes.
Agree with that.
That's vital. So, but on May 22nd, 2002, the jury returns a verdict.
That's right.
So tell us about May 22nd.
He was convicted. He was convicted of, and given 4 life sentences, 1 for each one of those girls.
One for each one. Now think about the families.
They were weeping. They were crying. Doug Jones, who of course now is senator for Alabama, was the one who prosecuted that case. And he had actually kind of tried to run for senator, at some point. And of course, then they weren't going to allow him to prosecute that case. So he wound up dropping out of that race. And so he was able to come in and prosecute the case. And at least to me, it's, along the moment, I remember he just had tears streaming down his face. And I said to him, a lot better than running for Senate, isn't it?
No doubt, right? No doubt. 39 years. 39 years, people.
Yeah, almost 40 years between the time that it happened and when he was convicted.
So you headed back to your wife, Karen. You headed back to Jackson, your family, and you kind of wondered, would the Bobby Cherry case be your last?
Oh, yeah. I mean, almost every one of these, I thought, when Bowers got convicted, it was a miracle for Sam Bowers to be convicted. A miracle in the Beckwith case. And then this one I was not expecting. And then, I just wound up, again, this was back in 99. This was when these cases kind of overlap. But I started working again on the Mississippi burning case because of this interview that Sam Bowers gave, which was sealed, and I was able to get somebody to leak it to me. And basically in that interview, he talked about the Mississippi burning case, which he was convicted in. And he said he was quite delighted to be convicted and have the main instigator of the entire affair walk out of the courtroom a free man. He was referring to Edgar A. Killen. And so that's what led me to Edgar A. Killen. And I contacted him, and we ended up, talking, and then met for catfish and one of those 895
barbecue this time. You met for catfish.
I got to keep them Klansmen fed. I want to keep them talking.
At any time, did you just think to yourself, I'm crazy?
I think that now. At the time I was just headstrong and younger and thinking, and Karen was convinced I was going to be killed. And I understand much more in retrospect than I did at the time. I'm much more sympathetic.
You had a few times that you note in the book where people even warned you that the FBI was interested in what you were doing and not necessarily in a supportive role.
Yeah, well, I had death threats from Klansmen. I had all sorts of things. I mean, but the thing that's kind of interesting to me about that, Don, is it led to an unexpected gift, and that's the gift of living fearlessly, right? Because living fearlessly is not about living without fear. It's about living beyond fear. And that's what we as people of faith do, right? We live beyond fear. We have nothing to fear anymore. And that's the one thing that's been kind of interesting to me, because that's what that is. Living fearlessly is about living for something greater than ourselves, right? And that's what it's all about. And you see it with the people in the civil rights movement, and you see it with people of faith. And that's one of the questions I often get is, weren't you worried you were going to be killed? And I remember I was talking to one reporter one time. He was a longtime reporter for CBS News. And I said, well, look, I figure if I get killed, I'll just get to go home sooner. Oh, okay. And that's something the world, struggles to understand. It's like, how are you able to, it's not me anyway, by the way. I never feel like it's me. But anyway.
That's right. I think about this powerful passage, Jerry, that gripped me. You and I and my wife, Susan, we were all in school, Karen, at the same time.
Right.
And, when I found my faith there and I found my relationship with God there, it began to shape a new way of looking at the world. And I remember a verse that was impressed on me.
Sure.
This is in the Apostle Paul's letter to the church in the region of Galatia, where he says, I've been crucified with Christ.
Exactly.
Right? Nevertheless, I live, but it's not I, but Christ who lives in me. So the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God,
exactly,
who loved me and gave his life for me.
Yep.
But I think that verse is so informative about the way you've gone about this commitment to just taking one step after another toward justice and loving people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the things that these cases have actually deepened my faith, to be honest, because after Sam Bowers was convicted, I dove more deeply into scripture about justice. And it became very obvious to me, not only does God love justice, but he is just. Ooh. It's a part of his very nature.
Yes.
And we tend to think of justice as, and of course we're talking about all these court, what happened in court, but it's so much beyond that. It's how do we treat each other, because when we begin to make differences, whether that's on the basis of money or the basis of race or whatever kind of thing, then we become, as James says, evil judges, right? We are meant to judge people, and as Paul says, we're meant to think more highly of other people than ourselves.
Yes.
Regardless, is more important than ourselves. I think it's actually what it says, important than ourselves. So boy, if we could all live by that, I mean, think about society. What kind of society would it have? We would all live by that.
Yes, yes. So tell us a little bit now. I'd like for us people to hear.
Sure.
I have this question for you. When we talk about the current climate, what might it look like if 26-year-old Jerry Mitchell was starting his journalism career in 2020?
It would look a lot different. I got to tell you, it would, social media and all that other kind of stuff. I think the fact that I was able to work on 4 cases like this, actually more than that, but these 4 are the ones that result in convictions. Basically, today you have the advantage of social media in the sense of tracking down people. So there's some advantages to social media, people that can come forward, those kind of things like that. But then the other part of that equation is it becomes known you're working on them. Whereas I kind of benefited from the fact that not everybody was reading the paper faithfully. I mean, each person I came to, when I came to Edgar Ray Killen, he said, there's some guy in Jackson who just keeps stirring things up. And I didn't have the heart to tell him it was me.
You had the good sense to not tell him that it was you.
Exactly. I didn't tell him it was me. So, but he insisted, when I asked him, because he said he didn't have anything to do with it. And I said, the killing of the 3 civil rights organizations. I said, what do you think chapter people were responsible? He says, I'm not going to say they were wrong. And then he told me that he actually wanted to shake hands with the assassin of Dr. King. And so, sometimes people, and then we may have talked about this before, but people say to me, Jerry, why don't you leave these old guys alone? And I tell them, these are young killers. They just got old. I mean, let's be honest about this.
Yes.
You should have prosecuted these guys a long time ago.
Yeah, and that's important. And that's one of the reasons that I think your book is so vital, is it actually pushes against our sensibilities a little bit and says, folks, wake up to the relevance of this vital work, right? Yeah. And I think that's important. Another question is this. Obviously, your interest was piqued in journalism in high school, and then each ensuing experience expanded that. But you recognize you can't do everything. You're not even gifted to do everything.
No, I don't know how gifted I am. I jack of some trades, maybe.
But you did decide that you would commit your life and whatever gifts you have to the role that you could play. What would you say to people who might be like, well, I'm not a journalist, or I'm not a this, or I'm not a that. I don't know how to do this part of, justice work. What would you say to people who kind of see themselves as unqualified to really make a difference?
I was totally unqualified. That's all I would say. I think the first step of any journey almost is admitting how unqualified you are to make the journey. I mean, listen, I was the least likely candidate to take this on. I mean, I knew almost nothing about the civil rights movement, period. I certainly knew next to nothing about the violence, incredible violence. I certainly knew about Dr. King's assassination. Yes. I was, I guess, 9 at the time. And so I was aware of things like that, but man, I was just woefully ignorant about all of that. And so I think I'm hoping in a sense that people can read the book and kind of, in a sense, have your own journey. And you may already be well on that journey. But I think I can't tell you how many people, both white and African American, have come back to me and said, I never knew all this happened.
Yes.
And my own mother, and this is the best review I've gotten so far because, of course, it's mom. But my mom, when she got done with the section on Medgar Evers, just had tears streaming down her face. And of course, she knows the Evers family very well, through me and our experiences. has gotten to know Merle and Rena and the whole family. And so my mom, after she read this section, she's crying and she says, I had no idea what they went through. And it was like, you can think you know this story. And I've had people, even the civil rights movement, tell me this. I thought I knew this story.
Yeah.
And it's just there's a depth that we often miss. You know, the civil rights movement gets reduced to Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King stood up, African Americans got their rights in the story. But just simple little details that people don't necessarily know.
Yes.
That Rosa Parks wasn't even the first Black woman to sit on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and refuse to give a receipt and get arrested. Yes. She was the fifth.
Yes.
And so that's, that just lets you understand that the civil rights movement was a broader kind of grassroots effort of
yes.
people. Many people, way beyond Dr. King, and that's not to take one thing away from him.
That's right. And I think the beauty of that is we see today, one of the lessons learned is how vital it is to recognize that every family, every community, every school, every business, every court system, every state system, every education system needs to be doing this work. And I think it's not lost on me that here you are having a highly recognized journalistic career and awards that other people can look up, because I'm only going to embarrass you once during the podcast.
Okay, all right.
Awards other people can look up, but you're still doing this, and now you've founded this agency to continue to do this. And so what is out there next for Jerry?
Well, I love the work. I think that if you think about this work, here's in my mind how it works. You've got to have truth before you have justice, right? And if you can't have justice, perhaps you can have reconciliation. But both those are impossible if you don't have truth. And so I view that as our role. As our slogan says, we shine a light and we expose darkness. I think that's so important, because for us as a democracy, there's no way for us to really operate without that.
Yes.
And then beyond that, if you think about beyond, you think of the church and others, we need that. You know what I mean? What I mean is it's so easy to kind of not necessarily sugarcoat, but just kind of pass over this and to not understand the depth. For us as white Americans, let's just be honest, it's very difficult for us to, we can even say we understand. Like that scene when Merle tells me that story, and that's what I said in my, I said I understood, but I realized I don't understand anything. I mean, have I ever had a loved one gunned down because of hate? Have I had someone killed by police? Whatever the situation is. And look, we have a lot of good police officers. I'm not knocking police, but I'm just talking about the historical encounters that African Americans have had with our law enforcement. And the other part you'd have to say, if it weren't for video.
Yeah. And I think what you're doing through your work, and I know what you've done for me, is you've held up a mirror. You've held up a mirror.
Hope so.
And called me to look at myself and the way that I function in the world. And Jerry, this is one of the reasons that it was so important for us to ask you to join us on this podcast, because the purpose, as we state every week, is to catalyze these courageous conversations so that someone will, close out the podcast and start an internal conversation with themselves to start a conversation with others. And what I'm hoping people will do is and this is what I want to encourage people to do. I'm asking you to purchase a copy of this book. I want you to do that. The title of the book, again, by Jerry Mitchell, is Race Against Time. A reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. I want you to get the book, start a book club, and just sit with each other and just start asking these questions. What did you know? What did you not know? What surprised you? What stunned you? How does it make you feel to watch that system go to work and destroy someone's life, and then the same system try to cover up that they were complicit in destroying that life? And then what does it mean for this self-confessed, unqualified green reporter to just let that seed of faith within you that believes what you were taught and what you were led to know from the teachings of Scripture, that God isn't just interested in justice, God is justice. God doesn't just love justice, God does justice. And so when you did your work, you were joining God in God's mission. And that's profound.
I mean, look at almost all these cases. What were the odds? And I've talked to Bobby DeLauder, the prosecutor, about this before. What were the odds at the beginning of that case that case would have ever been reopened, reprosecuted? Prosecuted. It's like 1,000,000 to 1. Bobby and I agreed 1,000,000 to 1 is probably accurate. The Sam Bowers conviction, in the Vernon De Mer killing, was probably 10,000,000 to 1. I mean, it was just like even more, and then the Birmingham church bombing, if not for these witnesses coming forward from various places because they saw it on TV or they read in the newspaper, they've told me themselves, the FBI we couldn't have done this case.
Look at that.
And then Edgar Ray Killen convicted on the exact anniversary of the killings, 41 years later.
Yes. And something that you state that I want everyone to hear. In the book, you point this out, that in the case of the Birmingham bombing, that had that case been delayed just 6 more months, and we're talking nearly 40 years, but had it been delayed just 6 more months, those witnesses would have all been passed away, and it never would have seen justice. So the title of your book, Race Against Time.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that we don't put off the urgency of the opportunity to live into justice and faithfulness and mercy. And Jerry, I want to thank you for being
Thanks for having me, Don. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Love First podcast. Friends, we would ask you to like, subscribe, and share. We would ask you to go on the website, mcir.org.
No, Mississippi,
right. Mississippi. I was using your email address. Sorry about that. Mississippi, CIR.org. And check this out. Support that work. Buy the book. And let's all commit to whatever gifts, energy, opportunity we have to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Thank you for joining us for the Love First podcast.
Love first,